Hello, Chicago. I'm Matt Kiefer. I'm the data editor at WBEZ and the vice president for freedom of information with the Chicago Headline Club. And it is my pleasure on behalf of the Chicago Headline Club to welcome the journalists, attorneys, public information officers, and community members, and especially those attending the Keynote watch party tonight to kick off the first night of FOIA Fest. And I'd invite you to use the chat on the right side to introduce yourself and tell us where you're from. And meanwhile, we'll start off the 10th annual gathering of FOIA Fest. I was just discussing this with my colleague, Kristen Schorsch, who was involved in planning the first FOIA Fest, and she described in vivid detail about planning the event and meeting her friends there. At the time, it was just a few sessions over 2 nights. Everyone crammed into the community room at WBEZ on the Navy Pier, and I think they went to the Billy Goat after. I wasn't there, but over the years, I've seen this conference shape up into something else entirely. We were at Loyola University downtown for many years, pivoted online during the pandemic. We've been able to expand the capacity and reach. This continues to be a great conference that grows every year. This is the biggest FOIA Fest ever, with 2.5 days of programming, around 30 sessions, close to 90 speakers, and around 350 registered attendees, many with free tickets that we distributed to community members, which just underscores what folks have said in the past, that FOIA is for everyone. Public information is not just for journalists, but for the community. And in these modern times, transparency, government accountability, a strong foundation for truth and a free press and freedom of expression are more important than ever. So on that note, we have something here for everyone during this conference, everything from FOIA 101, FOIA for organizers, deep dive into audio reporting, justice, the environment, schools, databases and programming, one-on-one consultations with FOIA attorneys and investigative editors, and a boot camp that pairs early career journalists and mentors. So there is something for everyone. And before we get started, I want to say thank you to those who made this happen, including our financial sponsors, Robert R. McCormick Foundation, the Driehaus Foundation, the Headline Club Foundation, and also our programming support sponsors, Better Government Association, City Bureau, and Lovey & Lovey. And last but not least, our core organizers, and I'd like it if you could amplify this and shout them out in the comments as you hear their names: Adam Rhodes, Alejandra Cancino, Amanda Vinicky, Amy Chin, Angela Caputo, Bettina Chang, Blair Chavis, Courtney Kippers, Elliot Ramos, Jonah Newman, Kelly Garcia, Kristen Schorsch, Maria Inez Zamudio, Marissa Nelson, Mary Hall, Maya Dukmasova, Mike Ewing, Molly McDonough, Nader Issa, Nona Tepper, Olivia Obinema, Sarah Conway, Taylor Moore, and the dozens of speakers and hundreds of attendees who signed up to support this. Thank you for making FOIA Fest happen, for supporting the development of emerging journalists, promoting the public's right to know, and making our city and state more open and more transparent. Sorry about the Slack noises. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our special guest and keynote speaker, Marina Walker Guevara, the executive editor of the Pulitzer Center, which is an organization that raises awareness of underreported global issues through direct support for quality journalism. It also has a unique program of education and public outreach, including here in Chicago. Prior to that, she was the deputy director for the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists, where she directed 2 of the largest investigations in journalism history, including the Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, which you may be familiar with. These are projects involving hundreds of journalists using technology to break stories in the public interest from terabytes of leaked financial data. She started her career in Argentina, reporting stories on environmental degradation by multinational corporations and the global offshore economy. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, Miami Herald, Mother Jones, Le Monde, and BBC. And she has won or shared more than 50 national and international awards, including the 2017 Pulitzer for explanatory reporting, which was for the Panama Papers. Finally, Marina was a John S. Knight Journalism Fellow at Stanford University in 2019. During her fellowship, she focused on using artificial intelligence to analyze big data sets for journalistic investigations. During that same year, she received the Missouri Honor Medal for Distinguished Service from her alma mater, the Missouri School of Journalism. I can't wait to hear what she has to say. I'll ask you all, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll have a brief Q&A afterwards. Marina, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm really honored to be here. Good evening, everyone. I'm just so glad to meet this vibrant and resilient community of journalists and innovators that gather around the FOIA Fest. I also want to say that my thoughts this evening are also with the people of Ukraine, especially the many brave journalists who are covering the invasion of their country at enormous personal risk. I am grateful that the topic of the conversation tonight is collaboration, a practice that has anchored my experience and my career in journalism and has allowed me to do things that I actually never dreamed were even possible. And speaking of impossible ventures, let me start with an anecdote. At the end of 2019, I was asked to highlight a non-journalistic collaboration that had resonated with me that year. I chose an example from science. On April 10, 2019, some of you may remember, astronomers at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics had declared at a press conference the following: "We have seen what we thought was unseeable." They were referring to the first ever photograph of a black hole, something that until that point had been considered impossible because to accomplish that, scientists would have needed to have a telescope the size of the Earth. So instead, 200 scientists joined forces and created a network of synchronized radio telescopes that were set to focus on the same object at the same time and act as a giant virtual telescope. So the more telescopes involved, the sharper the image. As the New York Times put it at the time, the scientists had to adjust the telescopes to work together. They had to get the timing right. They had to hope that the weather would cooperate in multiple places at the same time. Oh, and they also had to hope that nothing broke. It sounded crazy, but it worked. Now let's think about journalism and how that kind of cooperation and ingenuity grounded in trust and a little bit of crazy has allowed us to overcome our limitations, has broken new ground, and has allowed us to tackle stories that we thought would be impossible to do. Go no farther than the global pandemic of the past 2 years. Whether by force or by choice, stuck-at-home journalists have found bold and creative ways to cooperate across newsrooms and countries, discovering in the process a new sense of journalistic solidarity. They have used mapping and other digital tools to overcome mobility restrictions, whether in the Amazon rainforest or in Xinjiang in China, and cooperated with other disciplines, scientists, artists, educators, to get the context and the nuance that makes a story not only compelling, but truly relevant to the communities most affected. Take the example of Pro Da Vinci, an explanatory journalism digital outlet in Venezuela that has been at the forefront of COVID-19 reporting in a country that is devastated by multiple crises. To ensure that the stories reach offline communities in their country, Pro Da Vinci reporters partnered with college students and community leaders to turn their COVID-19 stories into large handwritten and illustrated posters that then they pasted on bus stops and grocery stores to reach marginalized communities with life-saving information. Much closer to home, here in Chicago, WBEZ approached its pandemic coverage in a similar way, collaborating closely with Black and Latino communities in their reporting on vaccine inequities. Most recently, their investigation into water debt involved mailing 18,000, you heard well, 18,000 postcards to Chicagoans struggling with water bill payments. The bilingual postcards, including a QR code that allowed individuals to use their mobile devices to view the investigation that maybe otherwise they would have never learned about. So let's pause for a moment to appreciate what a radical proposition collaboration of any kind still is in the context of journalism. I mean, do we get how many things we need to unlearn in order to put sharing and collaboration at the center of our practice? For centuries, journalism's whole ethos has revolved around hoarding information, scooping others, and getting ahead alone. Enter the lone wolf, a species that has been groomed in journalism schools, sought after by newsrooms, and hailed in industry journals and in award ceremonies. The thing is, the world got complicated, interconnected, and increasingly more dangerous. And so did the stories that the lone wolf was trying to tackle in glorified isolation. Let's think for a minute. How do you follow the money across dozens of tax-haven jurisdictions where secrecy and opaqueness are actually protected by law? How do you track commodities that are extracted illegally from protected rainforests and they make their way through dozens of intermediaries to luxury fashion and car industries in the US and Europe? How do you investigate algorithms that are everywhere, that are invisible, that are developed in Silicon Valley maybe or in Shanghai, but the data they are trained on is collected in Peru, is labeled in another country like the Philippines, and then those are used to develop models that are then deployed in like several other countries around the world? How do we tackle that complexity? I wish I could say that journalists had the foresight decades ago to predict that collaboration was the way to go before things got so scary. But no, we were kind of a little bit hit over the head with the news that our old methods could not match the complexity in many cases of the stories we had to cover. By going alone and following the status quo, we were in fact missing more stories than we were tackling. Or better said, we were missing the full picture, each of us pursuing a little tiny piece of the puzzle without even realizing what the bigger story was. Meanwhile, businesses, law enforcement, and criminals, they all had built networks of global cooperation. One of the reasons why disinformation spreads so quickly and effectively is because it relies on concerted cooperative efforts and carefully designed infrastructures that cross borders and languages and also political systems. So as my colleague Drew Sullivan says, we journalists needed a network to fight a network. I was fortunate to be part of one of the first attempts at organized journalistic collaboration. Most people learned about the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists when we published the Panama Papers in 2016, and were surprised to learn that the network had been around since 1998. I guess putting 376 journalists in 80 countries to work together doesn't just happen overnight, and it took us several years of trial and error and learning our old methods, tinkering with technology, and crucially, learning to trust one another. Here's a definition of trust that I like. Trust is confidence in the face of risk that the other person will do the right thing. We need to be certain in the face of risk or pressure that our collaborators will do the right thing. Observe the embargo, protect sources and the shared data, give appropriate credit, follow security protocols, and of course, do their share of the work. Ultimately, trust is the foundational stone that determines whether a collaboration thrives or crumbles. There are no digital tools or there is no coordination strategy that can overcome a lack of trust. That level of trust can only come from shared values. And one key value is humility. We acknowledge that there are stories that transcend us, that are bigger than our individual ambitions, our newsroom politics, and our ego. We put the story at the center of all of our efforts. We don't collaborate just out of the goodness of our hearts. We do it for the sake of the story and the audience and the community. Sharing the Panama Papers with 376 other journalists was a decision both practical and philosophical. Technology was only going to help us so much. We needed local knowledge, nuance, context to interpret the data, and that knowledge, access, nuance was only going to come from our colleagues in places as disparate as Mexico, Hong Kong, and Burkina Faso, because that's where the data was pointing to. This was a truly global data set. So collaboration, we learned, can be a powerful equalizer in the media ecosystem when it centers the role of local journalists, so often overlooked by national and global media. So when people ask me what was key to get this massive collaboration across the finish line, I say the people, the diversity of perspectives, skills, languages, geographies in the team, and the sense that we were all part of something bigger than ourselves, all united by something that transcended all of us. We shared radically, knowing all too well that any mistakes or breaches of trust could not only derail our story, but also the viability of collaboration in journalism. The Panama Papers, in all of their technical and editorial complexity, were in a way a perfect story to prove that the collaborative methodology that many of us and you had been testing at more modest levels for several years could be scaled globally. We also wanted to send a powerful or maybe decisive message to whistleblowers, to brave whistleblowers around the world, that journalists can be trusted, that we can get the job done, and that together we can do it in a way that is more effective and more impactful. Ultimately, the Panama Papers brought down two governments, helped recover more than $1 billion in taxes, and forever unsettled the narrative that tax havens are perfectly legal, victimless schemes. Equally important, no individual journalist or whistleblower became the story. The story itself and the solidarity among journalists remained always center stage. Then on October 16, 2017, we lost one of our own. Daphne Caruana Galicia, an investigative journalist in Malta who had dug deeper than anybody into the local connections of the Panama Papers, was blown to pieces by a car bomb. The conspiracy to assassinate Daphne started at the very top of the Maltese government. Our colleagues, the journalists we've been working with, immediately rallied as a network to go back to work, this time to investigate the assassination of our colleague and to continue her reporting. Soon a new organization was born, Forbidden Stories, whose mission is to use the power of cross-border collaborative reporting to keep alive the stories of journalists who have been silenced or murdered. Their motto, an attack on one is an attack on all. That same sense of solidarity and possibility, I think, has permeated the media ecosystem here in Chicago. You all have gone through so much in recent years, and yet there's this great momentum and synergy of people, ideas, and cooperative efforts. The merger of WBEZ and the Sun-Times has resulted in Chicago now having one of the largest nonprofit media organizations in the United States. What is going on in this city kind of reminds me of those scientists that we were talking about at the beginning, coordinating their telescopes from different corners of the earth to finally see what until then was unseeable. Remember, the more telescopes involved, the sharper the image of the black hole, as long as there was discipline, coordination, trust, and yes, a little bit of luck. I am counting on Chicago's journalistic ingenuity and courage to give us a sharper image of our dwindling democracy, a deeper conversation about the enduring legacy of racism in our country, and bolder ideas of how we might create a more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable media industry in the US. Here's to hoping that we continue to reach for the impossible and the unseeable with new tools, deeper determination, and more collaboration. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marina. I can almost hear people applauding at the keynote or at home. Thank you for that beautiful keynote address. I also appreciate the telescope array analogy. I really feel like that does literally kind of bring it into focus. We're looking at problems from different vantage points, and it's important to think about that collectively we can bring things into focus. That was beautiful. Thank you. I would invite folks again to submit your questions in the comments section as well as your applause. Thank you again, Marina, and we'll start off with a few questions. Please do add them to the chat window on the right. Marina, I really appreciated one of your comments about the either Panama Papers or Paradise Papers investigations, how technology only, takes you so far, and it takes local knowledge and nuance to actually understand data. Can you talk a little bit about how that played out in practical terms and how you were able to help decipher what would be very difficult to understand data because you had reporters on the ground from different corners of the world who could help you understand that?
Yeah. So imagine, 11 million records of complicated financial schemes and lots of names. At the end of the day, we realized we needed to start with the names. And, it was, I can sit here in Washington for days and months trying to Google things and names and use Pacer, or I can actually create this beautiful, specialized crowdsourcing operation where I team up with these journalists that for their entire lives and careers have been looking and investigating power in their own communities. And it takes them exactly 1 second to look at the documents, maybe not 1 second, but so much, it would be so much easier than for any of us to look at the documents and not only to recognize names, but to recognize the importance and the relevance, to be able to understand what is in the public interest, what is not in the public interest, and then know the context and what has been done and said about those people, those organizations, those sometimes criminal enterprises. So the role of these journalists was just incredibly crucial to the whole operation. And on our part, our role was to facilitate the access of this data and to make sure that we could really share it in a radical way, not just little pieces, not making it harder and having them travel somewhere to come look at the data, because then you would only get the Western reporters being able to travel. But to make the decision, is this information that we can actually put on a secure platform in the internet and make use of that, of the internet for radical access anywhere in the world in a secure manner. And by providing that access, a little bit of support and training, that kind of learning community that was formed around this investigation, and then that crucial local knowledge from the journalists all over the world who, after did their research, they would in real time share the findings and have conversations with one another. In the speech I said, like, they had like this, like, or was it like a giant telescope, or like in our case it was like a giant virtual telescope, and in our case it was like a giant virtual newsroom. We were all meeting together and in secret in some, for a long time, trying to decipher and to get that sharper image of what this really meant, what was in the public interest, and how we could tell this story in a way that would count.
That's so cool. I really appreciate the explanation of like how that all works out, and logistics and the technical part. And then, as you mentioned, trust, the key ingredient to trust that your partners are going to come through for you. And I'd just like to point out in Chicago, I think trust is kind of running pretty high right now, relatively speaking. We went from a 2-newspaper town to the point where it feels like there are a lot of smaller nonprofits that are collaborating in broader networks. The Circuit being one that Injustice Watch and Better Government Association and Data Native collected criminal justice data, make it available for investigations across town. There's countless numbers of collaborations that we hear about. Have a few questions here from the audience, one of which is, what advice would you give to a young reporter facing harassment? These days, there's a lot of sensitive subjects and a lot of opportunities for folks, personal information to be out there. And what sort of advice would you have in this day and age for that?
I do think that collaboration is one way to protect one another. We face these issues that are so scary and so different from anything we have faced before. And one of it is like online harassment, physical harassment. We experienced that during last year. Many journalists covering protests, suffer physical attacks. Journalists in this country have been called enemies of the people. And this, is bad. And it also pales in comparison to what colleagues are experiencing in other parts of the world. So I would say to young journalists, find your community. Whatever that community is a community around a topic that you are interested in covering. Maybe it's like you are an environmental journalist and you can join an environmental collective. Journalists in South Asia, where covering the environment is really important and it's really dangerous, they created a collective called the Environmental Reporting Collective. And that's how they do stories, that's how they support one another, that's how they raise money to be able to do their work. So I would say find your community where you belong, and hopefully that community has that kind of trust and that kind of ethos and spirit of like an attack on one is an attack on all. I think that we in the US need to be humble and recognize that for us it has not always been like that, because we have been very privileged and we have not experienced the kind of hardships that journalists in other countries have experienced. So at first, when we were being attacked during the past administration, I felt like journalists were kind of like shocked, but not jumping immediately to support their colleagues who were under attack. When somebody was shut down in a presidential press conference, I didn't see like 20 hands, raised to ask the same question. Sometimes we kind of like move on to see, okay, well, maybe I'll get my question answered. So yeah, lots to learn today.
That's a very good point. And on the topic of supporting each other, more on the subject of collaboration and how to navigate that, Cecilia Noel has a question about, do you have any thoughts about how freelancers can collaborate with each other and with larger newsrooms, and how does that dynamic work?
It is a very interesting point, and it's not always easy. I think that I want to give a lot of credit to freelancers, and we saw them coming through in the pandemic. At the Pulitzer Center, we launched a collaboration challenge, and a lot of the projects that we received and the proposals, and some of them we were able to support, were freelancers who were in different parts of the world or the country, and found in collaboration a new way to come together and to cover the stories that they could not longer go physically and be part of. I think I have also seen freelancers who have successfully come up with a very powerful idea and have been able to propose it to a local outlet or sometimes even to a national outlet, and get going with a collaboration. Collaborations doesn't have to be all giant and complicated. It sometimes can be, what I've seen is like a collaborator who got a really great collaboration going with a public health expert maybe, or scientist or researcher, or with a machine learning scientist. The journalist had amazing data. The data scientist was able to crunch that data in a powerful way that allows us to see parts of the story that would not have been possible. And then that freelancer goes to a local outlet and propose, well, you have the platform, I have the story, and here's the scientist who can crunch the data. Let's work together. Students around the country have been able to come up with amazing collaborations also in recent years through student newspapers. So I think that the good news is that I think the environment is the right one at this time to propose collaborations, but we need to continue educating editors and especially national media, because to this day, even just like a few weeks ago, I found myself in a conversation where I was exactly doing that. I was brokering a conversation between a local journalist who had an amazing idea that was bringing that idea to a national outlet, and the national outlet was going out of their way to try to see how could they possibly get the story without having to credit or work with the reporter who actually was bringing the story to them.
Oh, wow.
And so these things are still happening in 2022, but we're so much better than a few years ago.
That's a great point, and thank you for that explanation. If you can hang on for a few more minutes, we have a few more questions.
Sure.
And on that same line of thinking, we have a couple of questions about how do you, sort of as a staff journalist, convince your editor that a collaboration is worth the time, because there is work that goes into establishing a collaboration. You get more back in the end, but a lot of editors might be skeptical. And how do you also convince them that to drop the competitive nature and just think about the story?
I've been told many times, but why do we need to collaborate? It's less and less that, thankfully, but I think that a few things that we need to emphasize in these conversations is, first of all, obviously go with a great story. Ultimately, what is going to convince or persuade skeptical editors or reporters is that what we all want, that carrot, is like a great story or a piece of data or documents that are going to reveal something powerful, that are going to help us do work that is compelling. And so lead with the story. Don't try to start a collaboration with a theme. A theme makes everybody uncomfortable and unsettled, and it's easy to say no. Oh, it has been done a lot. There's no angle. So go when you have something concrete, like strong pre-reporting, data that is unique. It doesn't have to be a leak. It can be just amazing data scraped from for example, very unfriendly World Bank website. But once you scrape that data, there's actually pretty amazing information. And that was the beginning of one of our collaborations at ICIJ, just scraping data from the World Bank and finding the leads and then going to media organizations and proposing that. The other thing I would say is more and more, I think, outlets are realizing that it's good business to collaborate, that they get to expand audiences, that they get credit and they get credited in other languages. They get linked to, if it all works well, and there's that synergy and simultaneous publication. There's social media synergy that happens. And so for any outlets that are focused on audience and that understand how the internet works, they can realize how a well-organized, coordinated collaboration can bring them a lot of attention and traffic that they couldn't achieve on their own. And that is not to speak of the real world impact that these collaborations can achieve. and that hopefully we want to think that outlets want that more than anything else.
Those are great points. I also have a quick question. Hopefully, this is a good one. I like this. What are some of the top tools that journalists can use to investigate a story? What are some simple ones, maybe some more advanced ones? What kind of tools do you find to be effective with data-driven investigations or otherwise?
I think that we don't need to get super fancy, except in a few occasions. I think that journalists need to learn the basics of data and knowing, advanced spreadsheets and pivot tables, and being able to query data in basic but powerful ways. I just don't think that is optional anymore. I think every journalist should know a little bit of data. And then, once we have secured that, we can get a little bit more fancy. These days, and it's not even that fancy, but it's just very powerful. For example, using satellite imageries in the pandemic has expanded a lot among journalists and data journalists, because we couldn't go places. And so we had these powerful eyes on the skies that were able to show us what was going on. At the Pulitzer Center, we are supporting a network of environmental reporters reporting together on the tropical rainforest, on their destruction and criminality around that. And these satellite imageries have been able to show us in real time the destruction, the illegal runways that are developed in this tropical rainforest, as well as the gold mining operations that are spreading all over the place. So I just tell you, from like a very basic to like what can get more fancy. The other thing I would say is, like, if you're going to collaborate, make sure that there are many open source platforms that are great for collaboration, and don't collaborate over email. I would say that for real collaboration, Slack is probably also not enough. So find something that is a little bit more powerful and a little bit more secure, and it doesn't cost any money or cost very little, but allows you to really have that kind of experience of a virtual newsroom where you are sharing data, you are sharing leads, and you're sharing documents with your collaborators in a powerful way.
Yeah, and speaking of more advanced tooling, I'd like to ask just a couple more quick questions for you. So the Pulitzer Center recently launched an AI accountability network, and I was wondering if you just talk about how that program works and what impact that you hope that it has.
Thank you for that question. We believe that AI, automated systems, and algorithms are one of the most underreported and most urgent stories of our time. There's a great imbalance in our industry when it comes to covering that story. This is a story that is everywhere, that it touches everyone, and it touches all beats. So what we're trying to do with this AI accountability network is two things. On one hand, support journalists who are reporting on AI automated surveillance systems in their communities, specifically also how those systems intersect with issues of race and bias and more, hiring and social services, the criminal justice system. On the other hand, we also want to support the journalists who are using AI for good. So using machine learning as a tool in the newsroom to investigate stories that otherwise would be impossible to do. And we have several examples in our industry of successful investigations that have relied on this technology in a transparent and thoughtful way. And those journalists have shared their methodology. So supporting journalists working, investigating AI, and also using AI for good. So I invite everyone who is interested in these topics. You don't have to be a technologist. We are not looking for people with deep experience. We are looking to expand these beats and to make them more accessible to all journalists that are concerned about these stories and that are covering their communities. And this is happening in Chicago. These AI systems are being deployed there as much as in any other city in this country.
That's a good point. We've read so much interesting coverage of that in recent years. I'll just leave this last question for you, Marina, that I'm particularly interested in, which is what advice would you have for the up and coming journalists who are coming up next and who are or for that matter, folks who are just using public information to organize and activate their communities in addition to journalists. but who are sort of navigating this time of great change and uncertainty, specifically in the journalism industry, but just in general with the nature of truth, information, and the proliferation of data and different ways that folks can approach public information.
I think, again, we're seeing great examples of journalists joining forces on FOIA matters. We recently had an example in Maine of two newspapers that traditionally compete, joining forces to sue to obtain information about abuses by the police departments in the state of Maine. So I hope that we can see more cases like that. But also supporting from the Pulitzer Center, an organization that is doing like a super FOIA, like I think it's like 15 countries. So not only in the US, but also like working with collaborators in other countries and FOIAing the same information. So there's so much more that can be done when it comes to public information. And we don't need to do all the heavy lifting, and we don't need to do it alone. So how are we going to find those collaborators, again, from very early on in your career, that can then continue to be for the rest of your career, your buddies, your supporters, and those that are going to stick with you when things get a little bit difficult. And the other thing I would say is in this time of uncertainty and so much disinformation, the importance of being transparent with our own methods and holding ourselves accountable. We need to be a little bit more self-reflective about what part of the trust we have lost from our communities and what was our responsibility in losing it, and how we can, by being thoughtful and working in a more transparent and more collaborative way with the community, as well as some of the examples that I shared before, we can start to regain part of that trust. That is what can make a difference between a reporter who, with no consequence, and a reporter that can actually make a difference and have a concrete impact in a community.
That is such a good point to end it on. Marina, thank you again for delivering such an awesome keynote address. Very inspiring, and I hope that everyone in the audience got something out of that, whether it was about collaboration or experimenting with advanced technologies. There's really a lot there to unpack. And for everyone in the audience, just want to remind you that sessions start tomorrow and on Saturday starting at 9:30 a.m. So tell your friends to log in, to hop in ahead of time. All the sessions will be available for replay for a limited time after the conference. If you need anything, there is a link on the conference site for a support email. That's foiafestchicago@gmail.com. Also, please check out our code of conduct. That's it, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow on Happy FOIA Friday. Peace.
Thank you so much.